Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your curiosity, mash it up with some incredible source material, and give you the knowledge you need, without that crushing weight of information overload.
Today, we are taking a long, hard look at an artifact that, well, it sits at the absolute intersection of faith, history, and cutting-edge science.
We're talking about the Shroud of Turin.
It is, without a doubt, one of the most famous and, most intensely studied pieces of fabric on the planet.
Absolutely. For centuries, this massive, 14-foot 5-inch by 3-foot 7-inch length of linen has been revered as the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth.
And it bears this faint, ghostly negative image of a crucified man.
The sources shared by you, the listener, are just phenomenal. They detail the shroud's long, volatile history, its immense religious significance, and the truly exhaustive and often flat-out contradictory scientific analyses.
Oh, completely. We're talking forensics, radiochemistry, botany, even NASA image analysis. It's all been thrown at this thing.
So our mission today is to perform a kind of surgical extraction of the most critical nuggets of knowledge that define this whole debate.
Right. We need to establish the documented timeline and pay close attention to the forgery accusations that, date back almost to its first public appearance.
And then we have to dissect the scientific bombshell of the 1988 radiocarbon dating.
And finally, we have to wrestle with the fascinating but utterly contradictory evidence we get from forensic science about the image itself.
And here's the central paradox, right?
Yeah.
This is what keeps the debate raging, because you have to choose which evidence you prioritize.
Exactly. On one hand, the image looks impossibly real, anatomically detailed, and even three-dimensional, especially when you see it in a black and white photographic negative.
A discovery that wasn't even made until 1898 by the Italian photographer Secondo Pia.
A total accident that changed everything. But then, on the other hand, you have decades of rigorous high-tech testing on the fabric itself.
And that points squarely toward a medieval origin.
Squarely.
So what does it all mean? Okay, let's unpack this.
To start, let's ground ourselves in the physical reality of the cloth. It's a striking object, even without the image. It is rectangular, measuring about 4.4 meters long and 1.1 meters wide.
That's the 14.5 by 3.5 feet you mentioned. That's far larger than you'd think for a typical burial cloth.
It is, and the material itself, the weave, is a really significant detail, isn't it?
It's not just some plain woven fabric common to the era Jesus lived in, no.
Correct. And this is a crucial technical point that critics of its authenticity often raise. The cloth is woven from flax fibers in a very specific pattern. It's known as a 3-to-1 herringbone twill.
Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
It's just structurally more complex. It's generally associated with high-quality, more expensive textiles. And some historians argue that this type of, advanced weaving was either very uncommon or maybe even unknown in the first century AD Levant.
So the very fabric it's made of is a kind of historical question mark.
A big one. And this specific weave is the background for that faint, straw-yellow, brownish image that is its key feature.
And that image, it depicts a full-length double impression.
Exactly. It shows the front and back view of a naked man aligned along the body's midplane, with the two head images nearly meeting in the center.
And the man himself.
While forensic and image analysts have described the subject as muscular, bearded, with a mustache and shoulder-length hair parted down the middle.
So pretty consistent with the typical artistic representations of Jesus.
Very consistent.
How tall was the man imprinted on the shroud, based on the dimensions?
The consensus is that he was quite tall for any era, let alone the first century. Analysts estimate his height to range from about 1.70 to 1.88 meters.
Which is roughly 5 feet 7 inches up to 6 feet 2 inches.
A very tall man. And that stature is important when we later discuss some of the anatomical critiques, particularly the length of his arms.
And of course, the other key feature is the reddish-brown stains, which visually correlate with the wounds described in the gospel accounts of crucifixion.
Right, the scourging marks, crown of thorns, nail wounds on the wrists and feet, the spear wound in the side.
But as we'll see later, whether those stains are actually blood is a central, huge scientific dispute.
Oh, it's a massive one. But the visual power is undeniable, and that power just exploded in the modern era with the discovery of the negative image. We have to pause on Secondo Pia's 1898 photograph because that single event just redefined the shroud.
Right. Before 1898, the shroud was this yellowish-brown, kind of indistinct piece of old fabric. It was revered, sure, but the details were muted.
That's right. Pia took the first photograph in Turin, and when he developed the negative, the lights and darks were inverted. What was dim on the cloth became bright on the negative.
And that dim yellow image became a stunningly sharp, positive image of a face.
It was utterly unexpected, a modern sensation. It immediately suggested the image was not a painting in the traditional sense, but some kind of, well, light-sensitive imprint.
It's just astonishing that a medieval object, if it is medieval, would have a property that only modern photography, invented centuries later, could even reveal.
It's the central mystery. The negative effect instantly associated the shroud with the popular Catholic devotion to the Holy Face of Jesus, transforming it from a venerable object into a truly unique icon.
Okay, so let's pivot back to its documented timeline. Because for all the mystery, the history of the cloth itself is surprisingly short and immediately controversial.
That's the thing. The documented history doesn't begin in Jerusalem or Constantinople, but just abruptly, in the mid-14th century, in France.
The first reliable historical record places the shroud in Lire, France, around 1354, exhibited by a knight, Shroud of Turin.
And that is the official starting point for the artifact's paper trail in the West.
And the criticism was swift. We're not talking about skeptics 500 years later.
No. We're talking about people living only a few decades after its first showing.
Which is a massive point against its authenticity.
Precisely. By 1389 or 1390, the controversy had boiled over. Pierre d'Arcis, the Bishop of Troyes, the diocese where Lire was located, he wrote a detailed and scathing memorandum to the sitting anti-Pope Clement VII.
What did he claim? Did he just say it was fake or?
Oh, he gave specifics, stunningly concrete specifics. He explicitly denounced the shroud as a cunning forgery and claimed that a previous bishop, Henri de Poitiers, had investigated and had actually identified the artist who confessed to painting it.
He found the artist who confessed.
That's the claim. The artist's name isn't recorded, but the claim of identifying the perpetrator so early is a devastating historical accusation.
That is the ultimate smoking gun for historians and skeptics.
Yeah.
So how did the papal authority handle that?
Well, the initial papal response was a masterclass in diplomacy. Anti-Pope Clement VII permitted the exhibitions to continue, but he issued an extremely clear, legally binding order.
Which was?
He mandated that at every single public exhibition, it had to be proclaimed aloud that the representation was not the true shroud, but a painting or panel made to represent or imitate the shroud.
So the church basically said, you can venerate it, but you have to keep telling everyone it's an artistic representation, not the real thing.
Exactly. It was a didactic object meant to instruct the faithful, but not a genuine first-class relic. And that early explicit disclaimer is a crucial data point that often gets lost.
So the shroud's history then shifts as it gains powerful patrons, right? That doesn't just stay in this little church.
Not at all. In 1453, it was deeded to the House of Savoy, making it their central protective and revered object. It was moved to Chambéry, France, in the early 16th century.
And that's where it nearly met its end in the famous 1532 fire.
A critical event. A fire broke out in the chapel where the shroud was stored in a silver reliquary chest. Molten silver dripped down, burning holes right through the folded cloth.
Wow.
Fortunately, the image areas themselves were largely spared, but the damage was extensive. Poor Clare nuns immediately did repairs, patching the holes with these white triangular patches you can still see today.
So the patches we see are from that fire.
They are. The shroud was finally moved to Turin in 1578, and it has remained there ever since, housed in the cathedral's chapel of the Holy Shroud.
Given its age and trauma, the modern conservation must be extraordinary.
It's a high-tech fortress. It's stored flat on an aluminum support inside a specialized airtight display case.
Airtight.
Completely laminated with bulletproof glass and filled with an inert atmosphere of argon gas, 99.5% argon with only 0.5% oxygen.
To freeze the chemical processes to stop any more aging? Incredible.
The level of intense scrutiny applied to this artifact is so great that it has its own formal academic discipline, syndenology.
Its own discipline. That's amazing.
Historians, chemists, physicists, forensic pathologists, all dedicated to unlocking the mysteries in this one piece of fabric.
And it all really kicked into high gear after that 1898 photograph.
Yeah.
But all of it, for better or worse, has to contend with the single most famous scientific finding.
The 1988 radiocarbon dating.
The bombshell.
That was the moment the scientific world weighed in decisively. After years of negotiation, permission was finally granted to perform the test.
So explain the logistics. How was the sample taken, and what did they do to make sure it was impartial?
A small swatch of linen was taken from a non-image area near a corner. This sample was then divided and sent to 3 independent, internationally respected labs.
Oxford, Arizona, and Durham.
The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And they performed blind testing. They didn't know what they were testing, just that it was ancient fabric.
And the conclusion was pretty clear.
It was. With 95% confidence, the three labs collectively concluded that the linen material dated to a period between AD 1260 and 1390.
And that time frame, I mean, that's just a perfect match for its first documented public appearance in France, right?
A perfect match. It aligned perfectly with the first exhibition and the 14th century forgery accusations we just discussed.
So for most mainstream scientists, that was it. Case closed. It's a magnificent but medieval artifact.
From a radiochemist's perspective, yes. But for the proponents of authenticity, the syndenologists, the date just deepened the paradox. They immediately began mounting arguments to challenge the date.
Okay, let's unpack those challenges. The most famous one is the medieval repair hypothesis.
Right. This hinges on the location of the sample. It was from a corner near a damaged edge. The theory suggests the sample was taken not from the original first-century material, but from a fragment of thread woven in during a medieval repair process.
Like an invisible mending job.
Exactly. But subsequent analysis of the thread structure showed that the weave of the sample was generally consistent with the main body of the shroud. It didn't really hold up to scrutiny.
But what about other kinds of contamination? The biocontamination theories. This thing is old, it's been handled, it's been in a fire.
Absolutely. The argument is that centuries of exposure to bacteria, fungi, soot from the fire, all of that deposited new, younger carbon onto the fibers, making the whole thing seem younger than it is.
Could that really shift the date by over 1,000 years?
It's highly debated. The labs use rigorous cleaning protocols to remove contaminants. The counterargument is that the unique properties of the shroud, maybe the fire, might have sealed some contaminants inside the fibers where the cleaning couldn't reach them.
So the argument isn't that C14 dating is wrong, but that the sample wasn't clean.
That's the crux of it. And then there are researchers who just went back and looked at the raw numbers from 1988. This is the statistical inhomogeneity argument.
Okay, deep dive into the data itself.
Exactly. A 2020 analysis suggested that the data from the three labs lacked perfect homogeneity, a statistical term meaning the results weren't quite consistent enough to guarantee they all tested identical samples.
Meaning something was maybe different about one of the samples.
It implies something unusual was happening at the molecular level in at least one swatch. Maybe subtle contamination or an abnormality in the weave. The study suggested that if you adjusted the results by just 88 years, they would all fall into perfect statistical agreement.
But the original results didn't need any adjustment to land firmly in the medieval period.
Correct. The consensus is still strong, but it's these statistical fine prints that keep the skepticism alive. It's the perfect paradox. Clear answer, but maybe, just maybe, some unclear certainty.
So if the radiocarbon dating were the only piece of evidence, this would all be over. But it's not. The physical properties of the image itself, this is what defies easy explanation.
This is what elevates the artifact. We have to start with the superficiality of the image. It's not paint. It's a chemical change to the cellulose structure of the flax fibers themselves.
A translucent and discontinuous yellow discoloration.
And the depth of that chemical change is the crucial technical nugget.
This is the part I can't wrap my head around.
It's the single most baffling feature. The discoloration affects only the top 2 or 3 fibers of the threads, and it penetrates only about 200 nanometers into the external cell layer of each fiber.
Okay, 200 nanometers. To put that into scale for me, how small is that?
Well, a typical human hair is about 80,000 to 100,000 nanometers.
Oh, wow.
So we're talking about 1,500th of the diameter of a human hair. It is shallower than the resolution of the human eye.
So if a medieval painter had used a brush, the pigment would have soaked in much deeper.
Oh, absolutely. It would have created capillary action along the fibers. We don't see that here. And furthermore, the image isn't formed like a photograph where you vary the intensity of the color. It's an areal density image.
A halftone image.
Yeah.
Like a newspaper photo.
Exactly. The darkness depends on the number of yellowed fibers per unit area. In dark areas, almost every fiber is discolored. In light areas, only a few are. It suggests the process was highly controlled and extremely localized.
Which brings us to the famous 3D quality. This is the one that always gets cited as proof it's not a forgery.
It's compelling. In 1976, researchers used NASA technology, a VP8 image analyzer, on photographs of the shroud.
What did they find?
Something extraordinary. The image intensity was inversely related to the estimated cloth-to-body distance.
Meaning the parts of the cloth that would have been closer to the body, the nose, The forehead are the faintest, and the areas farther away, like the eye sockets, are the darkest.
Yes, the shroud literally encoded three-dimensional information. When you process it through a computer, it resolves into a remarkably realistic three-dimensional sculpture.
But there's a catch, right? It's not perfect.
It's not. The mapping isn't perfectly consistent with direct contact in all areas. And critics argue you could replicate this effect with, say, a bas-relief sculpture and specific lighting or chemical fogs.
Okay, so now let's move from the body image to the reddish stains. The question is it blood?
And this is where the experts truly came to blows. In 1978, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, got unprecedented access. But at the same time, a microscopist named Walter Macrone took his own samples.
And Macrone was a big deal in forensics.
A very big deal. And his conclusion was unequivocal. He said the body image was made with red ochre pigment in a gelatin medium. And the bloodstains.
What about them?
He found they were highlighted with vermilion, which is mercury sulfide pigment, also in gelatin.
Wait, mercury sulfide? That's just paint.
According to Macron, yes. He stated explicitly that he found no actual blood. He said the shroud was a masterful painting.
But the main STURP team? They vehemently disagreed.
They did. They used different methods, like spectroscopy, and they agreed there was iron oxide, but they argued it wasn't the source of the image. They rejected his conclusions completely.
So you have two respected groups using different scientific methods, coming to completely opposite conclusions.
It's the core of the conflict. It actually led Macron to resign from STURP.
And more recently, we got DNA analysis in 2015. What did that add?
Oh, just more complexity. They found human DNA from incredibly diverse groups. Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, even India.
So what does that mean?
It could mean anything. It's compatible with the shroud having traveled from the Near East. But they also found plant DNA and genetic markers that raise the possibility of an Indian manufacture of the linen cloth itself.
So the cloth might be from India.
It's a possibility the DNA raises. But to circle back, despite all this, has it ever been definitively proven that the stains are human blood?
I'm guessing no.
No, it has not been scientifically demonstrated, which leaves Macron's pigment finding just hovering over the debate.
And finally, on the forensic side, there are the anatomical flaws.
Yes. Early on, proponents claimed it was flawless. But later studies found significant contradictions.
Like what?
The arms appear far too long. The right arm is especially elongated, and the right hand is disproportionate.
And that elongation serves a very specific purpose.
It does. It allows the hands to cross over the genital area, covering the nudity in a way that's actually anatomically unrealistic for a relaxed corpse. It seems more like an artistic choice, reflecting the modesty of the 14th century.
And then there's the modern bloodstain pattern analysis.
A 2018 study concluded the blood flows are highly inconsistent. The rivulets on the forearms and the hand aren't connected. They would have required a sequence of impossible movements.
So the body would have had to be moving around after being wounded.
Exactly. The patterns are inconsistent between the front and the back of the body. The conclusion was that the blood was likely applied by an artist with a didactic intent to tell the story of the suffering.
This is where the mystery just reaches its peak. We have this solid C14 date, placing it in the Middle Ages. And yet we have these forensic properties that seem impossible for that era. So if it's medieval, how on earth did they do it?
That is the great challenge. How do you reverse engineer a plausible medieval mechanism for this?
Macron's idea was just simple painting, right? Grisaille?
Yes, using red ochre in a gelatin binder. His theory for the faintness was just simple wear and tear. Over centuries of handling, the pigment slowly rubbed off, leaving only the faintest trace.
But that struggles with the 3D property. That's where the bas-relief rubbing technique comes in.
An idea from Joe Nickel. It's compelling because it directly addresses the 3D problem. If you wrap a cloth around a full statue, you get wraparound distortion. The image looks stretched.
But the shroud doesn't have that.
No. So Nickel proposed they used a low-relief sculpture. You drape the cloth over it so it's mostly flat, and then you apply pigment with a rubbing technique, like from a gravestone.
And that would naturally create the 3D encoding.
It would. And researchers have replicated this. One used wet linen over a bas-relief and dabbed it with a mixture of ferric oxide and gelatin. The resulting image was wash-resistant and could withstand high heat.
So that's a plausible medieval mechanism?
It's a strong candidate. It solves the geometry and durability questions. It suggests ingenuity, not an unknown quantum event.
Then there was Luigi Garlacelli's attempt in 2009, the acid pigmentation method.
He tried to replicate the chemical nature of the discoloration. He rubbed linen over a volunteer with an acidic pigment and then aged it with heat and washing.
How did that turn out?
Visibly similar, but critics said it lacked the original's uniformity and fine detail. So we have plausible mechanisms, but the true method, it remains elusive.
We should briefly mention the non-scientific theory, the one you always hear, that it was a burst of radiation at the resurrection.
The fringe theory, it's overwhelmingly rejected by physicists.
Yeah.
A corona discharge or something similar would leave signatures like charring or fusion in the linen that just aren't there.
But the underlying idea that energy caused the discoloration isn't totally dismissed.
That's the nuance. Scientists agree that high-intensity UV light could create this specific type of discoloration. The challenge is, how could a medieval artisan apply UV light with such perfect geometric precision? The paradox persists.
To really understand the Shroud, we have to put it back into its religious context. The Gospels themselves complicate the claim.
They do. Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention a single shroud or synonym. That fits.
But John's Gospel.
John's Gospel, which claims to be an eyewitness account, is different. He mentions linen cloths, plural, and says the cloth for the head was rolled up in a separate place.
That's a huge inconsistency. The Shroud of Turin is one single piece of cloth.
Exactly. And this was noticed centuries ago. John Calvin used this discrepancy in 1543 to argue against its authenticity. So even before science, there was theological criticism.
Despite all this, the Catholic Church has maintained this, well, remarkably consistent, nuanced position.
Extremely careful. It's a position of reverent neutrality. The Church neither formally endorses nor rejects its authenticity.
Pope Francis called it an icon of a man scourged and crucified.
That phrasing is intentional. It focuses on its spiritual power as a mirror of the gospel, not its factual origin. Pope John Paul II was even more explicit. He said authenticity is not a matter of faith and entrusted the investigation to scientists.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, what is the final contradictory status of this artifact?
We have an artifact with a documented medieval history and a radiocarbon date from 1260 to 1390. That's accepted by the vast majority of scientists.
And it fits the forgery accusations perfectly.
Perfectly. Yet, the physical characteristics of the image, its incredible 200 nanometer superficiality, its halftone quality, its 3D encoding, remain scientifically baffling and difficult, if not impossible, to replicate perfectly.
The Shroud of Turin is perhaps the ultimate Rorschach test. You have to choose which evidence is more compelling, the dating of the material or the physics of the image.
And that choice often determines whether you approach it with faith, believing the image is a miracle, or with pure empiricism, believing the date is proof and the image is just a mystery we haven't solved yet.
The Shroud is the perfect artifact of information overload, a convergence of faith, forensics, chemistry, and history, where every clear answer just spawns a new, more complex question.
It's a remarkable piece of linen. We noted the DNA analysis showed it contains traces suggesting it traveled through or was exposed to people from the Near East, North Africa, Europe, and maybe even India.
And its status as a venerated object was cemented early. Pope Julius II authorized its veneration as a true relic way back in 1506.
That historical power is immense. The debate over how it was made is vital, but maybe its true significance lies not in who made it, but in the power it held and still holds over people and beliefs across continents.
This relic drove pilgrimages, war, intense scientific scrutiny for 6 centuries, regardless of its C14 date. That legacy, the human response it generated, is undeniable.
Something for you to mull or explore on your own.
A powerful reflection. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.